There was a room in Tokyo, high in a building that had survived what many others had not, and in that room a child sat very still, listening to the sound of a city rebuilding itself one hammer stroke at a time. The year was 1946, maybe 1947. The war had ended, but its echoes had not. The girl's name was Yoko, which meant ocean child, and she had learned during the years of fire and flight that stillness was a kind of protection, that you could make yourself small enough to slip between the cracks of history if you tried hard enough, if you barely breathed at all. She came from a family that had once had servants and silk kimonos, and a name that opened doors. Her father was a banker, her mother from the Yasuda banking family, one of the wealthiest in Japan. Before the war, they had lived between Tokyo and New York and San Francisco, moving with her father's career, inhabiting that rarefied air of the international elite. Yoko had attended the Peers School, an institution so exclusive that its students were almost exclusively the children of aristocrats and imperial family members. It was the kind of school where you learned to sit properly, to speak properly, to exist within the rigid hierarchies of a social order that believed itself eternal. But nothing was eternal. The war had taught her that. She remembered the firebombing of Tokyo, the night the sky turned orange, and the air itself seemed to scream. Her family had fled to the countryside, to a farming village where they traded kimonos for rice, where her mother's elegant hands learned to dig in dirt, where Yoko and her younger brother and sister learned what hunger felt like, the way it made everything else seem distant and unimportant. They lived in a farmhouse with a leaking roof. At night she could hear her mother crying quietly in the next room. There is a photograph from before the war, Yoko at perhaps 5 years old, standing in a white dress in a garden somewhere in America, her face serious, her eyes already watchful. She does not look like a child who smiles easily. Even then there was something withheld about her, something observing from a small distance. Her mother had wanted her to be a proper Japanese woman, which meant graceful and deferential and largely silent. Her father was often absent, working in Indochina, in New York, wherever the bank sent him. When he was home, he was formal, distant, a figure of authority who expected obedience without question. But Yoko had inherited something else along with the family name and the elite education. She had inherited a stubborn independence, a refusal to accept the boundaries others drew around her life. Even as a child, she asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Why must things be this way? Who decided? What would happen if we simply refused? After the war, when her family's fortune had been mostly reduced to memory and connections, Yoko enrolled at Gakushuin University to study philosophy. She was one of the first women admitted to the program. She read Kant and Hegel and tried to find in their systems of thought some answer to the chaos she had lived through. But the philosophy she found in classrooms felt abstract, disconnected from the immediate questions of how to live, how to make sense of a world that had revealed itself as capable of such comprehensive destruction. She was 18, 19, 20 years old. Tokyo was rebuilding itself in concrete and steel, burying its trauma under new construction, but Yoko felt restless, unmoored. The social structure she had been born into was collapsing, its rigid hierarchies exposed as fragile, arbitrary. Women of her class were still expected to marry well, to become elegant housewives, to disappear into domesticity. She married instead a composer named Toshi Ichiyanagi, a fellow student who was about to return to New York to study at Chuuida. It was 1956. She was 23 years old. She told her family she was going to study music. What she was really doing was leaving. New York in the late 1950s was not yet the New York of the 60s, not yet the city of happening and fluxus and downtown experimentation. But the seeds were there, in the lofts around Carnegie Hall, in the composers and artists who gathered to hear new music and argue about John Cage's ideas, about chance and silence and whether a piece could be considered music if it consisted only of ambient sound. Yoko found her way into these circles, this world of broke artists living in unheated spaces, making work that almost no one saw, that almost no one would have called art at all. She was very poor. She and Toshi lived in a loft on Chambers Street that was so cold in winter that water froze in glasses overnight. They had almost no furniture, almost no money. Yoko would later say that she learned during this period how to live on nothing, how to make something from absence. It was a useful education. The downtown art scene was not wealthy, not established. It existed in the margins, in the spaces between the official culture and the street, and it was remaking the very definition of what art could be. John Cage was the presiding spirit of this world, though he would have rejected any suggestion that he presided over anything. His ideas about chance, about the elimination of ego from composition, about the beauty of everyday sounds, were radical enough that many mainstream musicians dismissed him as a charlatan. But, for the young artists gathering in downtown lofts, Cage offered a way out of the inherited forms, the inherited assumptions about art's purpose and nature. If a composition could be created by flipping coins, if silence could be music, if the audience's coughing and shuffling could be the actual content of a piece, then perhaps anything was possible. Yoko absorbed these ideas, but she was also transforming them into something else, something that would belong entirely to her. She began writing instructions, simple, brief, often impossible directions for actions or states of being. Light a match and watch till it goes out. Listen to the sound of the earth turning. These were not poems exactly, though they had a poem's compression and strangeness. They were not musical scores, though they had a score's prescriptive quality. They were something else, something that existed primarily in the mind of whoever read them, in the act of imagination or attempted realization. In 1961, she organized a series of events at her Chambers Street loft. She sent out invitations to the downtown art world, to composers and painters and dancers and whoever else might be interested in an evening of something that was not quite performance, not quite concert, not quite anything that had a name yet. The space was nearly empty, just bare floors and white walls and cold winter light coming through tall windows. People sat on the floor. Yoko performed pieces that consisted of lighting matches, of following a score written for breathing, of inviting the audience to watch her paint until they left of their own accord. One piece, which she called Painting to be Stepped On, was exactly what it sounded like, a canvas placed on the floor for people to walk across. The painting was the act of walking, the accumulation of marks and dirt and wear. The audience was the artist. The artist was simply the one who had created the conditions for the work to exist. These ideas were in the air. The Fluxus movement was coalescing around the Lithuanian-American artist George Messiunas, who believed that art should be simple, amusing, unpretentious, concerned with everyday actions and objects. Fluxus concerts were often chaotic, playful events where performers did absurd things, smashed violins, served tea, made noises that were not quite music. The movement attracted artists from around the world, Nam June Pak from Korea, Joseph Bose from Germany, George Brecht and Dick Higgins and Alison Knowles from America. And Yoko, one of the very few women in this circle, one of the very few Asian women in the entire downtown scene. She was taken seriously by others. Messiunas himself was ambivalent about her, sometimes including her in Fluxus events, sometimes not. There was a particular kind of sexism endemic to the avant-garde of that era, a belief that the destruction of conventional forms would automatically lead to the destruction of conventional hierarchies, which of course it did not. Women in the Fluxus circle were often relegated to supportive roles, or their work was seen as less rigorous, less conceptually sophisticated than their male peers. Yoko's work, with its emphasis on imagination and inner experience, was sometimes dismissed as too soft, too feminine, not engaged enough with the material world. But she kept working. In 1962 she returned to Japan for a series of performances and exhibitions. She performed a piece called Wall Piece for Orchestra, where the audience was given instructions written on cards and asked to act on them. The instructions were simple. Make the saddest sound. Make the sound of fear. The performance had no score in the conventional sense, no predetermined outcome. It existed only in the moment of its realization, in whatever sounds the audience chose to make. She also met Anthony Cox, an American jazz musician and filmmaker who had come to Japan and fallen in with the Tokyo avant-garde. He was charismatic, confident, full of plans. He believed in Yoko's work in a way that few others did. He saw her not as a curiosity or a marginal figure, but as a major artist, someone whose ideas could change the way people thought about art entirely. They began a relationship. She divorced Toshi. She and Tony married and returned to New York together. In 1964, she gave birth to a daughter, Kyoko. That same year, she performed Cut Piece for the first time at the Yamaichi Concert Hall in Kyoto. The piece was very simple. Yoko sat on a stage in her best dress, kneeling in the formal Japanese style, and placed a pair of scissors in front of her. She invited the audience to come forward, one at a time, and cut away a piece of her clothing. Then she sat very still and waited. The first person approached tentatively, cut a small piece of fabric from her sleeve, and retreated. Then another person came forward, and another person came forward. Some cut small pieces, nervously, apologetically. Others cut more boldly, larger pieces, closer to her body. Someone cut away part of her dress at the shoulder, exposing her bra strap. Someone else cut higher on her thigh. The audience watched in silence, or near silence. Yoko did not move. Her face remained composed, neutral, though her eyes were open, watching. The piece lasted as long as it took for people to stop coming forward, or until her clothing had been reduced to scraps. What remained was Yoko sitting on the stage, nearly naked, surrounded by pieces of fabric. The performance ended not with applause but with a kind of stunned quiet, the audience confronting what it had just participated in. Cut Piece was performed again in Tokyo later that year, and then in New York at Carnegie Recital Hall in 1965. Each time it unfolded slightly differently, depending on the audience, the cultural context, the courage or aggression of whoever picked up the scissors. In Japan, the cutting was more tentative, more respectful. In New York, people were bolder, quicker to approach the boundaries of her body. But the structure was always the same. Yoko still, vulnerable, offering herself to whatever the audience would do, and the audience confronting its own capacity for gentleness or violence, its own relationship to a woman's body made available, made object. It is difficult even now to fully articulate what made Cut Piece so radical, so enduring. On one level, it was a performance about vulnerability and trust, about what happens when an artist removes all defense and invites the audience to act. On another level, it was about gender and power, about the way women's bodies are always already available for consumption, for cutting into, for taking pieces of. It was about spectatorship as a kind of violence, about the complicity of watching. And it was about endurance, about the strength required to sit still while others take from you, to remain composed while being unmade. The performance was also, in a sense, about instruction. Yoko had given the audience permission, had created the conditions for the act, but she had not determined what would happen. The audience made the work through their actions, their choices, their willingness or reluctance to participate. The performance existed only in that exchange, in the space between the artist's offering and the audience's response. This idea that the audience could be the artist, that imagination was the real medium, that the conditions for a work's existence mattered more than the object itself would define Yoko's practice for the rest of her life. In 1964, she published Grapefruit, a small book of instruction pieces collected from several years of work. The book's cover was plain, its design minimal. Inside were instructions for paintings, for events, for music, for objects that might or might not ever exist. Painting to hammer a nail into a mirror, a piece of glass, a canvas, wood, or metal every morning. Also, pick up a hair that came off when you combed in the morning and tie it around the hammered nail. The painting ends when the surface is covered with nails. Cloud piece. Imagine the clouds dripping. Dig a hole in your garden to put them in. Hide and seek piece. Hide until everybody goes home. Hide until everybody forgets about you. Hide until everybody dies. The instructions were playful, impossible, profound, absurd. Some could be enacted literally. Others existed only as propositions for thought. Some were melancholy, some were funny. Together they formed a portrait of an artist interested not in making objects but in opening spaces for imagination, for participation, for a kind of creativity that belonged to anyone willing to read the words and follow them in their mind. Grapefruit was published in a limited edition of 500 copies. Almost no one noticed. The book would not become widely known until years later, after Yoko had become famous for reasons that had nothing to do with her art. But in 1964 it was simply another artist's book, another small offering to the downtown art world, another piece of evidence that someone was thinking very carefully about what art could be if it refused to be an object, refused to be a commodity, refused to be a commodity, refused to be an anything except an invitation. Yoko was working constantly during this period, performing and exhibiting whenever she could, which was not often. She was still very poor. She and Tony and their daughter Kyoko moved between small apartments, always behind on rent, always scrambling for money. The art world was not interested in supporting work like hers, work that could not be bought or sold, that left no object behind. Galleries wanted paintings, sculptures, things that could be hung on walls or placed on pedestals, things with price tags. Yoko's work resisted all of that. It was generous and open and utterly uncommercial. In 1966 she moved to London with Tony and Kyoko. The London art scene was younger than New York's, more open to experiment, and there was a sense that something was happening, some cultural shift that had not yet fully revealed itself. The city was full of young people in strange clothes, music pouring out of clubs and radios, a feeling that the old hierarchies were crumbling, that a new world was being born. Yoko participated in the Destruction and Art Symposium, a series of events organized by Gustav Metzger, an artist who believed that creation and destruction were inseparable, that the act of destroying could be as meaningful as the act of making. Yoko performed Cut Piece again, this time at the Africa Centre in London. The performance had by now acquired a kind of legendary status in the small world of people who paid attention to such things. It was recognized as a major work, a performance that had changed what performance could be. She also exhibited at the Indica Gallery, a small space in Soho run by John Dunbar and Peter Asher. The exhibition was called Unfinished Paintings and Objects. It opened in November of 1966. The gallery was mostly empty, white walls, white floors. Yoko's pieces were scattered throughout the space, each one an invitation to participate, to complete the work through action or imagination. There was a white canvas with a magnifying glass hanging in front of it. If you looked through the magnifying glass, you could see a tiny word printed on the canvas. Yes. There was a ladder leading up to a canvas on the ceiling with another magnifying glass. If you climbed the ladder and looked through the magnifying glass, you saw the word yes again. There was a white board covered with nails and a hammer, inviting visitors to add their own nail to the piece. There was an apple on a perspex stand with a price tag, £200. The apple was real. It would eventually rot. That was part of the piece. On the opening night, before the exhibition officially opened to the public, a man came into the gallery. He was wearing a leather jacket and small round glasses. His hair was long, beetle length, though of course that should not have been surprising given that he was John Lennon, the John Lennon, most famous musician in the world at that moment, member of the most famous band in the history of popular music. He had come to the gallery at the invitation of John Dunbar, who knew him slightly, who thought he might be interested in the work. John Lennon climbed the ladder. He looked through the magnifying glass at the word yes. He asked Yoko if he could hammer a nail into the white board. Yoko, or perhaps the gallery owner, said it was not yet open, the work could not yet be touched. John Lennon said he would pay an imaginary 5 shillings to hammer an imaginary nail. Yoko said yes to that. There are many versions of this story, told and retold until the details blur and contradict. What is clear is that John Lennon was struck by the work, by its playfulness and its openness, by the way it said yes instead of no, by the way it invited participation instead of demanding reverence. He took one of Yoko's cards, a small instruction piece. He asked who the artist was. Someone pointed to Yoko's, standing in the corner, watching. They did not speak much that day. John left Yoko stained with her work, her nearly empty gallery, her exhibition that almost no one would see. She did not know who he was, not really. She knew the Beatles as a cultural phenomenon, of course, everyone did, but she was not interested in popular music, did not follow celebrity, did not care about fame. She was an artist, working in obscurity, making work for the handful of people who understood what she was trying to do. But John Lennon remembered her. Over the next year he would occasionally visit her studio, look at her work, ask questions. He was married, she was married, both of them were occupied with their separate lives, but something was beginning, some attraction or recognition, some sense that they understood each other in a way that others did not. By 1968, both of their marriages were ending. Tony Cox was increasingly controlling, jealous, angry about Yoko's attention turning elsewhere. John's marriage to Cynthia Lennon had been fraying for years, a union that had begun before the Beatles became famous and had not survived the transformation. John and Yoko began spending time together, first as collaborators, then as something more. They made experimental films together, strange short pieces that showed nothing happening very slowly. A match burning, a face in slow motion, a fly crawling across a body. They recorded sounds together, Yoko's voice howling and shrieking over John's guitar. Music that was not really music, that was more like a purging, a release. In May of 1968, they spent the night together for the first time at John's house in Surrey while Cynthia was away. They stayed up all night making a recording, an experimental album that would eventually be released as Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. The cover was a photograph of the two of them completely naked, facing the camera without shame or coyness, just two bodies, middle-aged and ordinary and exposed. The image was shocking, not because it was sexual, but because it was so vulnerable, so undefended. It was the visual equivalent of everything Yoko had been doing in her performance work for years. The world lost its mind. The photograph was considered obscene. Distributors refused to carry the album unless it was sold in a brown paper bag. The British press, already suspicious of Yoko as a foreign woman who had seemingly stolen one of Britain's most beloved musicians, erupted in outrage and mockery. She was called names, caricatured, dismissed as a talentless opportunist who had bewitched John Lennon, who had ruined him, who was destroying the Beatles, because by 1968 it was clear that the Beatles were ending. The band that had been the center of popular culture for half a decade was fracturing under the weight of its own success, its members pulling in different directions, unable to collaborate without conflict. John's relationship with Yoko was only one factor among many, but it became the symbol of the band's dissolution, and Yoko became its scapegoat. She was in the studio with them now, sitting quietly in the corner during recording sessions, a presence that violated the unspoken rules of the Beatles' working process. Paul McCartney and George Harrison and Ringo Starr resented her, or resented John's insistence that she be there, or resented the way John's attention had turned away from the band toward the strange, silent woman who seemed to have no understanding of the Beatles' music or its importance. The press picked up on this tension and amplified it, creating a narrative in which Yoko was the villain, the dragon lady, the woman who had broken up the most important band in the world. The racism embedded in this narrative was barely concealed. Yoko was repeatedly referred to as Oriental, described with stereotypes drawn from wartime propaganda and cheap exoticism. She was inscrutable, manipulative, a kind of witch who had cast a spell over poor innocent John. The sexism was equally blatant. Women who attach themselves to famous men are always suspect, always accused of riding coattails, of having no talent or value beyond their relationship. That Yoko had been a working artist for over a decade before she met John, that she had been a significant figure in the Avant-Garde, that her work had influenced an entire generation of conceptual artists, None of this mattered to the press or the public. She was Yoko Ono, the woman who broke up the Beatles. John and Yoko married in March of 1969 in Gibraltar, a quick ceremony at the British consulate, and then flew to Amsterdam for their honeymoon. But instead of disappearing into privacy, they held a bed-in for peace, inviting the press to their hotel room at the Amsterdam Hilton, where they stayed in bed for a week, talking to journalists about peace, about nonviolence, about using their celebrity to draw attention to the possibility of a world without war. It was absurd and sincere at the same time. Classic Yoko and its blending of performance and life. Classic John and its mix of naivete and genuine conviction. The press came, of course, expecting something scandalous, and found instead two people in pajamas, surrounded by signs reading hairpiece and bedpiece, patiently explaining that if world leaders spent a week in bed instead of making weapons, the world might be a better place. They held another bed in Montreal that May, this time recording a song during the event. Give Peace a Chance was recorded in their hotel room with dozens of visitors and hangers-on contributing to the chorus, a simple sing-along that became an anthem for the anti-war movement. John credited the song to Lennon-McCartney out of habit, though Paul had nothing to do with it. It was John and Yoko's first collaboration as a public entity, the first song that belonged to them as a couple, as a partnership. They bought an estate in Berkshire called Tittenhurst Park and began living a life that was half retreat, half ongoing performance. They were constantly making work films, recordings, art pieces, public statements. Yoko was teaching John her methods, her way of thinking about art as instruction, as participation, as something that happened in the mind before it happened in the world. John was teaching Yoko about music, about how to structure a song, though Yoko's approach to music was so radically different from conventional songwriting that it could hardly be called music at all. Her vocal performances were raw, primal, often wordless shrieks and wails that disturbed even sympathetic listeners. In 1969, they formed the Plastic Ono Band, an entity that was not really a band, but a name for whatever collaborations they felt like doing. They released albums that confused and alienated rock fans expecting something resembling the Beatles. Unfinished Music No. 2, Life with the Lions, included recordings of Yoko's miscarriage, the heartbeat of their lost baby, her voice calling its name. It was almost unlistenable, a document of grief made public, made art. They were together constantly now, John and Yoko, inseparable in a way that struck others as unhealthy, codependent, strange. But they seemed to need each other, to draw strength from each other's presence. John had spent his entire adult life as a Beatle, living in the spotlight, never alone. Yoko had spent her adult life in obscurity, making work that almost no one saw. Together they occupied a strange middle space, famous and avant-garde at the same time. Celebrities who made uncommercial art, pop stars who wanted to dismantle pop. In 1970, the Beatles officially ended. John released Plastic Ono Band, an album of raw, painful songs about his childhood, his mother, his rage and vulnerability. It was the first album he made after undergoing primal scream therapy with Arthur Janov, a therapeutic process that involved screaming and crying and accessing buried trauma. The album sounded like someone being torn open, which is more or less what it was. Yoko released her own Plastic Ono Band album the same day under the same title in the same plain packaging. Her album was just as raw, just as painful, but in a completely different musical language. Where John's album had conventional song structures and melodies, Yoko's was dissonant, atonal, her voice moving from whispers to screams over sparse, experimental instrumentation. It was difficult, challenging, confrontational. Most listeners ignored it or dismissed it as unlistenable. But for those willing to engage with it on its own terms, it was a powerful, harrowing work, a document of a woman refusing to perform femininity or beauty or accessibility, insisting on her own difficult, uncompromising voice. They moved to New York in 1971, partly to be closer to Yoko's daughter Kyoko, whom Tony Cox had taken into hiding after a bitter custody battle. For years Yoko would search for her daughter, hiring private investigators, following leads that went nowhere, living with the agony of not knowing where her child was, whether she was safe, whether she even remembered her mother. The pain of this loss runs through much of Yoko's work from this period, a deep grief that could not be resolved, could only be endured. New York in the early 70s was broke and dangerous and alive. The city was bankrupt, the streets were dirty, crime was everywhere. But the downtown art scene was thriving in the ruins, artists living in cheap lofts in Soho, making work in abandoned buildings, creating a culture outside the commercial mainstream. John and Yoko moved into the Dakota, the grand old apartment building on Central Park West, a place that was stately and gothic and slightly decaying, much like the city itself. They threw themselves into activism, supporting radical causes, attending demonstrations, giving money and attention to groups advocating for prisoners' rights, women's liberation, the Black Panthers. The FBI began monitoring them, building a file that would eventually run to thousands of pages. The Nixon administration, paranoid and vengeful, tried to deport John, seeing him as a threat, a celebrity who might influence young people against the government. The deportation battle would drag on for years, a constant source of stress and uncertainty. Yoko was creating her own work throughout this period, though it was often overshadowed by John's, ignored in favor of his latest album or statement. In 1971, she had a major exhibition at the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, New York, called This Is Not Here. The exhibition was a retrospective of sorts, gathering instruction pieces, participatory works, and conceptual objects from throughout her career. John helped promote the exhibition, bringing his celebrity to bear, which meant that the opening was mobbed with fans who had no interest in the work itself, who just wanted to see John Lennon. But the exhibition was significant, a recognition that Yoko was a major artist in her own right, not simply John's partner. The works on display included pieces from the early 60s, instruction paintings, participatory events, everything that had led to cut piece and beyond. Visitors could add to a mending piece, could participate in wish trees, could follow instructions that led them into their own imaginations. The exhibition was generous and open, asking nothing of its audience except willingness to engage, to play, to imagine. In 1973, John and Yoko separated. The reasons were complicated, tangled up in John's drinking and Yoko's exhaustion and the strain of living constantly in the spotlight. John moved to Los Angeles for what would become known as his Lost Weekend, though it lasted for 18 months. He drank heavily, made poor decisions, recorded albums that lacked the focus of his best work. Yoko stayed in New York and worked. The separation was painful for both of them, but it was also perhaps necessary, a chance for each of them to remember who they were outside the intense fusion of their partnership. Yoko released Feeling the Space in 1973, an album of feminist anthems that was more accessible than her earlier work, though still uncompromising in its politics and its willingness bodies, women's anger, women's desire. The album was ignored by most critics, dismissed as dated or strident, the usual complaints directed at women's art that refuses to be polite. By early 1975, John and Yoko were back together, reunited and determined to make their relationship work. Yoko became pregnant. John's deportation case was finally resolved in his favor, allowing him to stay in the United States. Their son Sean was born in October of 1975 on John's 35th birthday. And John made a decision. He would stop making music, stop being a public figure, and devote himself to being a father and a husband. For 5 years he barely left the Dakota, baking bread, taking care of Sean, living a domestic life so completely removed from his previous existence that it seemed like a different person entirely. Yoko, meanwhile, managed their business affairs, invested their money, handled the details of their lives. She had discovered she had a talent for this, for the practical work of managing assets and making deals. It was a role that earned her further scorn from a public that wanted her to be either a saint or a villain, not a competent businesswoman. She was accused of controlling John, of keeping him locked away, of preventing him from making music. The narrative had shifted, but the hostility had not. In 1980, John decided he was ready to return to music. He and Yoko went into the studio together and recorded Double Fantasy, an album that alternated songs by each of them, a conversation between two people in a long marriage, each bringing their own perspective, their own voice. John's songs were warm and domestic, full of contentment and love. Yoko's songs were more complex, edged with ambiguity, aware that love contains its own difficulties, its own contradictions. The album was released in November of 1980. The reviews were mixed. Some critics welcomed John's return. Others found the album too soft, too domestic, not edgy enough. Yoko's songs were, as usual, dismissed or ignored. But the album was selling well, finding an audience, suggesting that there might be room in the world for music about middle age and marriage and the quieter forms of happiness. On December 8, 1980, John and Yoko spent the day doing interviews and working on a photo shoot. They returned to the Dakota late in the evening. As John walked through the archway into the building's courtyard, a man who had been waiting for hours stepped forward and fired 5 shots. 4 of them hit John. He stumbled into the Dakota's office, said, "I'm shot," and collapsed. He died at Roosevelt Hospital before midnight. He was 40 years old. Yoko was with him when he died, and then she was alone in a way that is almost impossible to imagine, the center of a grief so enormous and so public that it became a kind of global event. Millions of people mourned John Lennon, held vigils, played his music, wept for the loss of someone they felt they knew. But Yoko had lost her husband, her partner, the person she had been inseparable from for more than a decade. And she had to mourn him in front of the entire world, her grief monitored and judged, her every action scrutinized. She did not attend a public funeral. Instead, she asked people to observe 10 minutes of silence for John, wherever they were. On December 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, millions of people around the world stopped what they were doing and stood in silence. In Central Park, across from the Dakota, more than 100,000 people gathered. Yoko could hear them from her apartment, or perhaps she could only imagine them. A vast crowd standing in silence, holding vigil for her husband, for the man she loved, for the partner she had lost. The years after John's death were years of survival, of learning how to live with a grief that did not diminish but only changed shape. Yoko released Season of Glass in 1981, an album that directly confronted John's death, that refused to soften or sentimentalize it. The cover showed John's bloody glasses, left on a table after the shooting. It was a shocking image, raw and undefended. The songs were painful to listen to, Yoko's voice crying out, asking why, refusing to accept comfort. Critics called it exploitative, ghoulish, an unseemly display of grief. But it was also honest, uncompromising, a document of what it feels like to lose someone to violence, to have your life shattered in an instant. She released more albums throughout the 80s, some of them dance-oriented, working with musicians from the downtown scene, experimenting with new sounds. The albums were largely ignored. She was still in the public imagination, primarily the woman who had been married to John Lennon, the woman who had broken up the Beatles, the woman who was somehow responsible for every bad thing that had happened to the band and to John. The rehabilitation of her reputation as an artist was still years away. But she kept working. She oversaw the release of John's unfinished recordings, carefully curating how his music would be presented to the world. She protected his legacy while also insisting on her own separate identity, her own work, her own voice. She dealt with her son Sean, who was only 5 when his father died, who grew up in the shadow of an absence he could barely remember. She searched for her daughter Kyoko, who had been missing for years, who finally made contact in the early 90s, after all that time. A reunion that was private and perhaps never fully healed the years of separation. Throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, Yoko's work began to be reconsidered by a new generation of artists and critics. Feminism's second and third waves were recuperating women artists who had been erased or dismissed, and Yoko was a prime example of that erasure. Younger artists working in performance and participatory art began to cite her as an influence, to recognize that her instruction pieces from the 60s had anticipated much of what would later be called social practice or relational aesthetics. Cut Piece was performed again, this time by others in galleries and museums, each performance a reminder of how radical the original had been, how prescient. In 1993, the Venice Biennale awarded her a Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement. In 2000, the Walker Art Center organized a major retrospective, Yes, Yoko Ono, which traveled to museums around the world. The retrospective was comprehensive, showing the full range of her work, from the early instruction pieces to the participatory installations, to the film work, to the music. Younger audiences encountering the work for the first time were struck by how fresh it felt, how relevant. The instruction pieces in particular seemed to speak directly to a generation raised on the internet, on the idea that content could be participatory, that the audience could also be the creator. Wish Tree was one of the works that resonated most. The piece was simple, a tree either real or installed, with paper tags and pens. Visitors were invited to write a wish on a tag and hang it on the tree. Over the years, in cities around the world, hundreds of thousands of people have participated, writing their wishes, their hopes, their secret desires, and hanging them on branches that become heavy with paper, with longing, with the accumulated dreams of strangers. Yoko collected the wishes, stored them, eventually buried them in Iceland near the imagined Peace Tower, a memorial to John that sends a beam of light into the sky every year on his birthday. The Wish Tree was classic Yoko, participatory, open-ended, generous. It asked nothing except that you articulate a wish, that you imagine a better world, a fulfilled life, whatever you most wanted. It was an artwork that existed only because people chose to participate in it, that was completed not by the artist but by the audience. And it was also deeply political, in the sense that imagining peace, imagining a better world, is always a political act, always a refusal of the world as it is. As Yoko aged, she became a kind of elder stateswoman of the avant-garde, celebrated by institutions that had once ignored her, invited to speak and exhibit and collaborate with younger artists. She worked with musicians like the Flaming Lips and Sonic Youth, artists who understood that her approach to sound was radical and influential. She curated exhibitions, reissued her early albums, oversaw the continued dissemination of her work. She was in her 70s, her 80s, still making new pieces, still insisting on the possibility of peace, of imagination, of a world transformed through attention and care. The irony, of course, is that even as the art world was finally recognizing her significance, the larger public still knew her primarily as John Lennon's widow, the woman who broke up the Beatles. The sexism and racism that had dogged her for decades had not disappeared, had only receded slightly, still visible in the comments sections of articles about her, in the way people spoke about her, in the assumption that her work was secondary to his, that she owed her career to his fame. But Yoko herself seemed less interested in correcting the record than in simply continuing to work, to make, to invite participation. In interviews she was calm, patient, sometimes playful. She did not argue with her critics or try to convince skeptics. She simply pointed to the work, to the decades of consistent practice, to the instruction pieces and fermomens and albums that formed a coherent, ambitious, deeply thoughtful body of work. The work spoke for itself, if you were willing to listen. Cut Piece continued to be performed, sometimes by Yoko herself, even into her 80s. The sight of an elderly woman sitting still while strangers cut away her clothing added another layer to the work, another dimension of vulnerability. Age had not protected her, had not made her safe. She was still willing to sit in silence, to offer herself, to trust that the audience would know when to stop. In 2015, the Museum of Modern Art presented a retrospective called Yoko Ono, One Woman Show 1960 to 1971, focusing on the decade when she produced her most radical work, before she met John, before she became famous for reasons that had nothing to do with her art. The exhibition was hung chronologically, showing the development of her ideas, the consistency of her vision. Visitors could participate in many of the works, could hammer nails, could add to mending pieces, could follow instructions written on cards. The exhibition was enormously popular, attracting crowds that included both art world insiders and people who had never been to a museum, who came because they were curious, because they wanted to understand who Yoko Ono was beyond the myths. Walking through the exhibition, you could see the arc of a life dedicated to a single set of propositions, that art could be instruction, that the audience's imagination was the real medium, that participation was more important than object-making, that peace was not naive but necessary, that mending broken things, objects, relationships, the world itself, was an act of profound creative power. These were not fashionable ideas in the early 1960s, when Yoko first articulated them. They were not even entirely fashionable now, in an art world still largely organized around the production and sale of objects. But they endured because they were generous, because they insisted that everyone was an artist, everyone capable of imagining a better world. Yoko turned 90 in 2023. The pandemic had forced her into isolation, into the Dakota apartment where she had lived for more than 50 years, where John had died, where she had raised Sean, where she had grieved and worked and aged. She was still making art, still collaborating with musicians, still overseeing the release of archival material, still insisting on peace. Her voice, when she spoke in interviews conducted over video calls, was still strong, still curious, still asking questions. There is a late photograph of Yoko standing in front of a wish tree, surrounded by paper tags heavy with other people's wishes. She is small, white-haired, wearing dark glasses. Her expression is serene, perhaps amused. The tree is so full of wishes that its branches sag under the weight. Behind her, slightly out of focus, you can see other people approaching the tree, reading the tags, writing their own. The photograph captures something essential about her work, that it creates conditions for other people's creativity, that it invites participation rather than demanding reverence, that it continues to exist as long as people are willing to engage with it. The question of legacy is complicated for any artist, but especially for one whose life became entangled with a figure as culturally dominant as John Lennon. For decades, Yoko's legacy was inseparable from that relationship, from the narrative of the woman who broke up the Beatles, from the sexist and racist caricatures that followed her through every stage of her career. But slowly, patiently, the art world and the broader culture have begun to correct that narrative, to recognize that Yoko Ono was a major artist before she met John, that her work influenced generations of artists working in performance and conceptual art, that her ideas about participation and instruction were radical and enduring. The rehabilitation has not been complete. There are still those who dismiss her, who cannot separate her from the myths, who hear her voice and hear only the woman who ruined the Beatles. But increasingly those voices are drowned out by scholars and artists and critics who understand her significance, who can trace her influence through the decades of work that followed her, who recognize cut piece as one of the most important performances of the 20th century, who see grapefruit as a foundational text of conceptual art. What remains when we look at Yoko's work, divorced as much as possible from biography and celebrity and the weight of accumulated myth, is a body of work remarkable for its consistency, its generosity, its refusal to be anything other than what it is. The instruction pieces, the participatory works, the performances, the films, the music, all of it insists on the same set of principles. Art is not an object, but an activity. The audience is not passive, but essential. Imagination is more powerful than material reality. Peace is possible if we imagine it first. Broken things can be mended. Wishes matter. These are simple ideas, almost childlike in their directness. But they are also radical, especially in a culture that values cynicism over hope, possession over participation, individual genius over collective imagination. Yoko spent more than 6 decades insisting on these ideas, working them through in every medium she touched, never wavering, never compromising, never softening her vision to make it more palatable. The work endures because it is open. You can walk into a room with one of Yoko's instruction pieces and you can choose to participate or not, to engage your imagination or not, to believe in the possibility of peace or not. The work does not demand anything. It simply invites, and in that invitation is a kind of faith, a belief that people are capable of creativity, of kindness, of imagining a world different from the one we have. There is a piece from 1963, early in Yoko's career, before cut piece, before John, before fame or infamy. It is called A Box of Smile. The instructions are simple. A box, empty, except for a mirror in the bottom. When you open the box and look inside, you see your own face looking back. That is the smile. You are the smile. It is a joke almost, but it is also profound. The work does not exist without you. You are not the audience. You are the work itself. This idea runs through everything Yoko made, every instruction piece, every performance, every participatory work. The artist creates the conditions, the frame, the invitation. But the work itself exists only when someone else engages with it, completes it, brings their own imagination and presence to it. This is not a rejection of authorship or artistic vision. It is an expansion of it, a belief that art can be more than one person's expression, that it can be a collaboration between artist and audience, a shared space of imagination and possibility. As Yoko enters her 10th decade, still working, still imagining peace, still inviting participation, the question of her legacy becomes less about historical reputation and more about influence, about the ways her ideas have seeped into the culture, often without attribution, often without most people knowing where they came from. The contemporary art world's embrace of participatory practice, of social engagement, of instruction-based work, all of this owes a debt to Yoko, whether or not her name is invoked. The feminist performance artists of the 70s and 80s looked to cut piece as a model for work that addressed gender and vulnerability. The conceptual artists working with language and instruction studied grapefruit. The musicians exploring noise and vocal experimentation heard her albums and recognized a radical alternative to conventional song. But beyond the art world, beyond the circles of people who pay attention to such things, Yoko's work has also reached people who might never enter a museum, who might never think of themselves as interested in art. The wish trees, scattered around the world, collect wishes from everyone: children, old people, tourists, locals, the lonely and the hopeful and the desperate. The instruction to imagine peace is so simple that anyone can do it, which is precisely the point. Yoko never wanted her work to be exclusive, to require special knowledge or access. She wanted it to be available to everyone, to operate at the level of thought and imagination, the things we all share. There is a late work called Mend Piece, variations of which have been shown in museums around the world. The piece consists of broken ceramics, smashed dishes and cups and vases, and tape and glue and string. Visitors are invited to mend the broken pieces, to choose fragments and try to put them back together. The mended objects are fragile, held together with tape, obviously damaged, but also put back together, made whole again in their brokenness. It is a metaphor, of course, but not a heavy-handed one. The work is what it is, broken things being mended, imperfectly, collectively. People sit for hours sometimes, carefully taping pieces together, trying to restore what was shattered. The work is never finished. New broken pieces are added. New participants mend them. The pile of broken and mending ceramics grows and changes. It is beautiful in its brokenness, in the evidence of care, in the accumulated labor of strangers trying to fix things. This is as good a summary of Yoko's work as any, an invitation to mend broken things, a belief that collective effort matters, a refusal to accept that what is broken must stay broken. It is work that believes in possibility, in transformation, in the power of small acts repeated by many people. It is work that believes, despite everything, in peace. The narrative of Yoko Ono's life is often told as a tragedy, or at least as a story overshadowed by the loss of her daughter for so many years, the loss of John, the loss of her reputation to sexism and racism and the machinery of celebrity, and those losses are real, or devastating, shaped everything that came after, but the work itself does not feel tragic. It feels hopeful, open, alive with possibility. It invites you to participate, to imagine, to wish, to mend. It believes that you, whoever you are, whatever you bring to it, are enough. Perhaps that is the real legacy, more important than retrospectives or critical reassessments or historical corrections. The work remains open and available, inviting participation from anyone willing to engage. The instructions are still readable, still followable, still capable of sparking imagination. The wish trees still collect wishes, the mending pieces still invite mending. The image of a woman sitting still while an audience cuts away her clothing still disturbs and challenges and asks questions about vulnerability and power and the violence of looking. Yoko is in her 90s now, living through history, again a pandemic, political chaos, the world teetering on the edge of various catastrophes. And still she insists on peace, still believes in the power of imagination, still invites participation. It would be easy to dismiss this as naive, as the privilege of someone insulated by wealth and fame. But Yoko lived through war, through hunger, through the firebombing of Tokyo. She lost her husband to a man with a gun. She spent years searching for her daughter. She was villainized and mocked and dismissed for decades. And still she says, imagine peace. Make a wish. Mend this broken thing. Believe that change is possible. That insistence, in the face of everything, is its own kind of radicalism, not the radicalism of destruction or confrontation, though her work has contained both, but the radicalism of stubborn hope, of refusing to accept the world as it is, of believing that imagination, the simple act of thinking a different thought, can begin to reshape reality. There is a late interview where Yoko is asked about Cut Piece, about whether she would perform it again. She is in her 80s at this point, frail but still sharp, still curious. She says yes, she would perform it again, has performed it again. And then she says something surprising, that the piece is not about her at all, that it is about the audience, about what they choose to do, how they choose to act. She is simply creating the conditions. They make the work. This is vintage Yoko, deflecting attention from herself, insisting on the primacy of participation, of the audience's role in completing the work. But it is also a statement about art's purpose, about what she believes art is for. It is not self-expression, or not only that. It is a space open for others, an invitation extended, a possibility offered. The artist is the one who creates that space, who issues that invitation, who frames that possibility. But the work itself exists in the exchange, in the moment when someone else steps forward and participates, and so the work continues, long after the artist's hand has aged, long after the initial moment of creation has passed. Someone reads an instruction in grapefruit and follows it even decades after it was written. Someone approaches a wish tree and writes their hope on a tag and hangs it among hundreds of others. Someone sits with broken ceramics and tape and tries to put the pieces back together. Someone watches a video of Cut Piece and confronts their own relationship to vulnerability and power and the act of looking. The work continues because it is generous, because it refuses to be closed or finished, because it believes in people's capacity to imagine and create and transform. This has been Yoko's project from the beginning, from the earliest instruction pieces in the early 1960s to the work she is making now in her 10th decade. to create art that exists only when someone else engages with it, that trusts the audience to complete it, that believes imagination is more powerful than any object. It is a body of work built on faith, not religious faith necessarily, though Yoko has spoken about Buddhism and meditation and the practices that sustain her, but faith in people, in creativity, in the possibility of transformation. It is work that asks, what if we imagined peace? What if we mended broken things instead of throwing them away? What if we trusted strangers with scissors and our own vulnerability? What if art was not an object to be bought and sold, but an activity to be shared? These questions are still radical, still unresolved, still capable of provoking and disturbing and opening new ways of thinking. The fact that we are still asking them, still engaging with work made 60 years ago, is evidence of their power, their endurance, their refusal to be neatly resolved or put away. As Yoko ages, as her body slows, as the work of simply continuing becomes harder, the work itself remains strangely young, strangely fresh. A new generation encounters cut piece and is shocked by its audacity. A child writes a wish on a tag and hangs it on a tree. An artist reads grapefruit and realizes that instructions can be artworks, that imagination is a medium, that the audience is essential. The work does not age because it has no fixed form, because it exists in the moment of engagement, because it is recreated each time someone participates. There is something almost utopian about this vision of art, this belief that everyone is an artist, that imagination can change the world, that small acts of attention and care matter. It is a vision that refuses cynicism, refuses despair, refuses to accept the world as it is, and perhaps that is why the work has endured, why it continues to speak to people across generations and cultures and contexts, because it offers an alternative, a different way of being, a possibility that exists nowhere except in imagination, which means it exists everywhere for anyone willing to think it. The sky is still there, above us, available to anyone who looks up. Yoko told us to imagine it, to light it on fire, to drill a hole in it and peek at the sky from yesterday, to paint it until it becomes all sky. These instructions are absurd and beautiful and impossible, and completely possible, depending on how you understand what art is, what imagination is, what it means to make something. And so we return to that room in Tokyo, to a child sitting very still, listening to a city rebuild itself, one hammer stroke at a time. She is learning that stillness is a kind of strength, that survival requires imagination, that the world can be unmade and remade, that even after fire and hunger and loss, you can begin again. She does not know yet that she will spend her life insisting on peace, making work that invites participation, trusting strangers to complete what she has begun. She does not know that she will be vilified and celebrated, dismissed and honored, that her work will be misunderstood for decades before being recognized as essential. She does not know that she will live long enough to see the record corrected, to see her work enter the canon, to see young artists cite her as an influence and inspiration. She knows only that the world is large and broken and full of possibility, that imagination is powerful, that you can survive anything if you can imagine something different. She sits very still and listens. The hammering continues. Something is being built. Something is always being built. The work continues. The invitation remains open. Imagine peace.